The rain hadn't let up since sundown. It fell hard against the tin roof of the Renshaw ranch house, drumming like distant hoofbeats. The wind pushed in from the canyon, sharp and cold, rattling the shutters and carrying the scent of wet earth and juniper. Colt Renshaw stood by the fireplace, nursing a chipped mug of black coffee, his silhouette long against the orange glow. He was used to nights like this, solitary, quiet, unchanging. But then came the knock, 3 soft raps against the wooden door. Not loud, hesitant, like someone unsure if they still belonged. He froze, mug halfway to his lips. Nobody came out this far at night, not with the storm rolling heavy like it was. He set the cup down, grabbed the shotgun off the wall by instinct, then thought better of it and leaned it back in its place. When he opened the door, the lantern light spilled into the dark. And there she stood, Asha Redbird, the last person he expected to see again. The girl, no, the woman who had once worked these lands like they were her own. The one who left 6 months ago without a word, leaving behind only the faint scent of sagebrush and the memory of dark eyes that held both silence and storm. She was soaked to the bone. Rain dripped from her braids, clung to the edges of her deerskin shawl. Her moccasins were caked with red mud, her shoulders trembling under the weight of the cold and something heavier. In one hand, she held a faded canvas satchel. In the other, a folded piece of paper, wrinkled at the edges like it had been clutched for hours. Colt didn't say anything at first. Couldn't. He just stared at her, taking in every detail, every trace of the girl who used to laugh while breaking horses in the back lot, who always left fresh coffee on the porch rail before he woke. "Evening," she said finally, her voice hoarse, barely louder than the rain. Her lips were trembling, but her eyes didn't look away. "I ain't here to ask for the job back." Colt cleared his throat. "Didn't figure you were." A long pause settled between them like the fog rolling in from the hills. He could see the way her fingers tightened around the paper, could see the dirt under her nails, the exhaustion in her posture, but also something else, something unshaken. "I left," she said, "but I didn't leave you." That stopped his breath. The rain seemed to fade behind the weight of those words. "I had to go," she continued, voice breaking just enough to betray the battle behind it. "Back then, I didn't know how to stay. Not when everything was twisted up in my chest. But even when I was gone, I carried this place like a stone in my boot. I tried to outrun it. Couldn't." Colt stepped aside. "You're soaked." Asha shook her head. "I ain't here to get dry. I'm here to hand you this." She offered him the folded paper. "Read it when you're alone." He took it without opening it. His fingers brushed hers, warm beneath the cold. Their eyes locked for a long moment. Asha's gaze was steady, raw, proud. There was nothing pleading in her face, but something else. Honesty, maybe. Or grief that had finally found the words. "You're not the only one who didn't know how to stay," Colt said quietly. His voice was lower now, stripped of the bark and gravel it usually carried. "I've been here every damn day and still felt like I wasn't home." Neither of them smiled. Not yet. Asha dropped her satchel by the doorway and turned to leave, rain swallowing her form again. But Colt's voice stopped her. "You don't have to stand out in the storm." She didn't turn around. "Not tonight," she murmured. "I just needed to knock." And then she walked off into the dark, disappearing like a ghost returned, just long enough to rattle the living. But in Colt's hand was proof she had been there. A message, sealed not in ink, but in courage. He closed the door slowly, paper still in hand, and stared at the fire until the chill in his chest had somewhere to go. Tomorrow he'd read what she wrote. But tonight the ranch wasn't as empty as it had been. Back then, Asha Redbird lived in the small lean-to cabin behind the horse stables, just east of the Renshaw Ranch windmill. It was nothing fancy. 4 walls, a potbelly stove, a straw mattress laid over cedar planks. But it was hers. And more than that, it was safe. Colt Renshaw had taken her in when few would. In a land where Apache women were either feared or forgotten, he gave her work. Steady, honest work. And never once treated her like she was less than the ranch hands who rode fence or broke colts for a living. She mucked stalls, collected eggs, helped patch saddles. She stitched torn shirts when no one else knew how to thread a needle. And each evening, when the wind settled and the coyotes started howling from the ridge, She'd sit on her porch step and watch the lantern flicker in the main house window, knowing he was still awake in there, sipping black coffee, reading records by firelight. She never called it love, not out loud, but it lived somewhere deep inside her chest, that sharp, silent pull toward the man who never smiled much, but always noticed when she limped, who didn't talk often, but left her a blanket when frost set in early. Colt Renshaw was carved from grit and sun, broad-shouldered, flannel-backed, with eyes the color of winter creek water, a man molded by hardship. And Asha, well, she had no business wanting something from him that went beyond her place in the barn. Then his wife got sick. Yellow fever, folks said. Or maybe it was childbirth gone wrong. Nobody ever said it plain. One day the preacher rode out. A few days later, the undertaker followed. After that, something in Colt hardened. He didn't shout, didn't throw bottles or break windows like some men did when grief came calling. He just got quieter, stopped shaving, stopped sleeping. He rode fence lines long after sundown. Some days he'd forget to eat, and the house got real quiet, too quiet. Asha kept her head down. She did the work, fed the animals, swept the front porch even when no one asked. But the rhythm of the ranch had shifted, and everyone felt it. The chickens laid less. The horses got mean. And Asha started walking on eggshells. She wasn't sure when it happened. Maybe it was the night she made stew and left it by his door, only to find it untouched the next morning. Or maybe it was when he started calling her Miss Redbird again, instead of just Asha. Whatever it was, something had changed. Then came the day she brought him the monthly ledger. She knocked, stepped inside, and found him at the table, staring at a piece of fabric, his late wife's shawl. He looked up, and for a second, Asha thought she saw something break behind those weathered eyes. But when he spoke, his voice was cold, measured. "You don't need to carry more than what's yours, Asha." She didn't answer, just nodded and set the ledger down. She walked out of that house feeling like her heart had been carved out with a dull knife. That night, she packed her things. It wasn't much. A pair of moccasins, a stitched-up Bible, a keepsake pouch from her mother, and a note she never gave him. A note she'd written weeks earlier, full of words she couldn't say. Not to a man who was grieving, not to a man whose heart still belonged to the dead. As dawn broke, she slipped away before anyone could stop her. The gate creaked behind her one last time. She didn't leave out of anger or pride. She left because she'd fallen in love with a man who wasn't hers to love. And the silence between them had grown so wide, she feared if she stayed, it would swallow them both whole. The town of Dry Creek wasn't much. A handful of buildings clung to either side of a dirt road, stubborn against the wind. There was a mercantile, a two-room schoolhouse, a blacksmith, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Kelter, who rarely smiled but never turned anyone away hungry. That's where Asha Redbird landed after leaving the Renshaw Ranch. She traded her labor for room and board, scrubbing linens, hauling water, chopping kindling. Some days she'd take up work at the apple orchard east of town, balancing barefoot on ladders, her fingers raw from plucking fruit until dusk. Nights were hardest. Alone in the attic room with its sloped ceiling and single cracked window, Asha would lie awake listening to the wind scratch at the shingles like it remembered her name. She tried not to think of Colt Renshaw, but that was like trying not to breathe. It wasn't the big things that haunted her, not the silence between them, not the ache of what had never been said. It was the small things that crept in like smoke under the door. The way he used to leave her a slice of corn cake wrapped in cloth on the fence post near the stables. Or the time she caught her ankle in a gopher hole, and, without a word, he spent half the next day repairing the entire section of trail so she wouldn't trip again. Or the time he stood out in the rain to patch the barn roof, even though it was her job that week, and when she asked why, he'd only said, "Figured you had enough weight on your back." She'd never answered him, just held his gaze longer than she should have. That had been their way, talking without speaking, hoping the other could read the spaces between. In Dry Creek, folks were polite but distant. She was Apache, after all. They didn't say it to her face, but the space they gave her at the laundry line, or the way their children stared, spoke louder than words ever could. Still, she endured. She scrubbed shirts until her knuckles bled, carried baskets of wet sheets down to the creek and back. And on her rare afternoons off, she went to the schoolhouse, sitting with the younger girls and asking the teacher, Miss Boyd, to help her with her reading. "I just want to read my own letters," Asha had said once, without needing someone else's voice in the way. But even with the alphabet slowly taking shape in her mind, she couldn't bring herself to read what mattered most: the letter she'd written to Colt. She kept it folded in the bottom of her satchel, pressed between a cloth-wrapped stone from her childhood river and a broken comb. She rewrote it often, each time in neater handwriting, each time with fewer words. Somehow writing it down was easier than speaking it, but sending it? That was something she couldn't do. Because what if he never read it? What if he did, and it meant nothing? So instead, she held her silence and walked the edges of town like a ghost, living, but not quite alive. Then one night, a storm rolled in. The kind that makes windows groan and dogs crawl under porches. Thunder cracked like gunfire over the plains, and rain slapped against the roof like a warning. Asha couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the street lamp flicker in the wind. Her hands moved without thinking, pulling paper from the drawer, dipping pen and ink. But this time, she didn't rewrite the letter. She reached for the old one, the wrinkled, smudged, honest one. The one that had been written with a trembling hand on her first week in Dry Creek. The one where she told him, "I left because I was afraid of wanting something I couldn't have. But I've learned that wanting and being brave enough to stay are not the same thing." She stared at the page for a long time. Then slowly she folded it once, then twice, and slid it into the satchel. She didn't know what she'd do with it yet, but for the first time in months, she knew she had to do something. The wind howled outside like a coyote mourning the moon. And inside, Asha Redbird finally stood up, her jaw set, her eyes dry, her heart not whole but no longer hiding. Colt Renshaw ran the ranch alone now. He'd let the last two ranch hands go by early spring, one too careless with the stock gates, the other too loose-lipped with whiskey and gossip. Folks around Dry Creek said he was better off without hired help anyway. Safer that way, quieter. The land didn't care if a man grieved. It still needed fences mended, water drawn, calves branded come branding time. Colt didn't mind the solitude. At least that's what he told himself. He rose before the sun, when the sky was still the color of tin, and lit the stove with his bare hands before the chill burned out of the floorboards. Every chore was a ritual. Boots on, hat down low, work done in silence. The barn was his chapel, the cattle, his penance. By nightfall, he collapsed into sleep like a man carrying 50 pounds in his chest and refusing to set it down. The main house stayed cold most nights. He only lit the fireplace when the frost crept under the windows, and even then, he sat far from it. He'd taken his late wife's rocking chair to the attic and never touched her sewing things. Her shawl still hung behind the door. There was no music, no letters sent, no visitors, only the wind. Sometimes late at night, Colt would sit at the kitchen table, oiling his rifle or sorting ledgers, and he'd catch himself glancing toward the back window, the one that used to look out toward the stable cabin where Asha lived. That window stayed dark now. The chickens still clucked. The horses still needed grooming. But the place had lost something, something that made it feel like more than land and nails. He didn't speak of her, not to the grocer, not to the blacksmith, not even to the preacher when he stopped by with his usual invitation to Sunday service. He simply tipped his hat and got back to work. But the neighbors had their own story. You'd hear it whispered between sacks of grain and barrels of salt. Colt Renshaw ain't been right since his wife died, and that Apache girl left. He walks that pasture like he's looking for someone who ain't coming back. Ain't no man works that hard unless he's trying to outrun something. They weren't wrong. Colt worked like a man on fire. He planted more rows than he needed, repaired fences that didn't need mending. He repainted the barn twice that summer, then left the ladder standing in the grass like he'd forgotten why he started. Each morning, he passed the stable cabin. The door was still there, slightly crooked on its hinges. The roof sagged a little more with each season. He never opened it, never went in. But he didn't tear it down either. He told himself it was practical, that maybe one day he'd hire help again. But deep down, he knew the truth. He couldn't bring himself to let it go. That cabin held echoes, of laughter low and quick, of footsteps he used to recognize by sound alone. of a voice that asked him, quietly, respectfully, if he wanted more coffee before heading out into the fields. Sometimes, just before sleep took him, Colt remembered the way she used to hum while hanging laundry, how she smelled faintly of smoke and river mint, how her eyes would meet his and hold. Just for a second too long, but he always shook the memory loose. What good was remembering something you couldn't change? The prairie had its own way of softening grief over time. The wind wore it down like rock, slow and patient. But some things Colt didn't want soften. Some things he kept sharp because they were all he had left. And so he stayed. Stayed with the cattle, stayed with the silence, stayed with the ache that never spoke but never left. Until one rainy night, someone knocked, and everything he'd buried began to stir. It started with a letter that bore no name, just a single sheet of rough parchment, folded neat, tucked inside an envelope with no return address. The handwriting was careful, shaky in places, as if written slowly by someone not long familiar with letters. It arrived with the Morning Post, wedged between a grain invoice and a seed catalog. Colt Renshaw nearly tossed it into the fire without opening it. But something about the weight of it, the restraint, the way the ink barely pressed into the page, made him pause. Inside was a modest proposal, a hand-drawn plan for a field care station during harvest, a tent with cool water, clean bandages, a shaded cot for those who collapsed from heat. It was written plainly, but with thought, the kind of thinking that came from first-hand experience, not theory. At the bottom, one line stood alone. If you take care of the hands, the land will take care of you. There was no signature, no way to trace where it came from, but Colt stared at that sentence a long time. And then, without speaking of it to anyone, he built it. Not the tent exactly, but a makeshift shelter near the south field, fashioned from spare timber and old burlap. He set a rain barrel beside it and brought a crate filled with clean rags, a jug of whiskey, and 2 folded wool blankets. Come autumn, when the harvest season kicked dust into every lung and made backs ache by noon, the station quietly did its job. He told no one why it was there, just shrugged when the blacksmith's boy came by asking for water. Seemed like the right thing to do, he said. Weeks passed. Then came the second package. No note this time, just a small cloth sack tied with twine, nestled among the feed supply like it had been placed there on purpose. Inside, seeds, tiny, oval-shaped, dull blue with speckles, unfamiliar to Colt. But he recognized the stitching on the bag. Apache. Something stirred in his chest. He planted them in the northeast corner of the garden, the part where his wife's herbs used to grow. He didn't know what they were, but his hands trusted the act, trusted the rhythm of pressing seed to soil, of covering them gently, of waiting. In 3 weeks they sprouted, thick green stems, delicate purple flowers, strong for something so small, hardy, quiet, just like her. He never said her name out loud, not even in the silence of his own home. But now he found himself walking by that patch every morning, brushing his fingers along the petals, remembering things he'd buried under work and weather, a shawl left hanging by the hearth, boot prints too small to be his outside the barn, a voice that always said thank you like she meant it. He never wrote back, didn't know where to send anything. But he started watching the mailbox differently, not for news, not for business, but for something that might come again. Something that might mean someone out there still thought of this place, of him. Sometimes at night he sat by the fire and reread that first letter. The ink had begun to fade, but he knew every word by heart now. And though he never said it aloud, the truth wrapped itself around him like the evening chill. She hadn't forgotten, and neither had he. Colt Renshaw had spent years surviving by routine, by grit and solitude. But now with each envelope, each seedling, each unseen gesture, he realized he wasn't as alone as he thought. And somewhere out there, Asha Redbird was still writing letters, even if she never signed them. The rain hadn't let up. It fell steady and hard, soaking the porch planks and carving little rivers down the dirt road that led to Renshaw Farm. Thunder rolled low over the plains like a slow breath, and the lantern by the barn door swayed on its hook, casting long, ghostly shadows across the ranch. Colt Renshaw opened the door like a man bracing for a memory. And there she was. Not a ghost. Not a dream conjured by too much solitude. Asha Redbird, standing in the rain, rainwater dripping from her braids, clutching something close to her chest. Not a suitcase. Not a bundle of clothes, but a folder thick with folded pages wrapped in oilcloth to keep it dry. She looked up at him, lips trembling but jaw set. "I didn't come to ask for my old job back," she said, "and I'm not here because I got nowhere else to go." Colt didn't move. He just watched her, the firelight behind him framing his shoulders like the edge of a mountain. Asha swallowed hard and lifted the folder. "I came to bring this." He took it without a word. She stepped under the porch, finally out of the rain, but she didn't shake off the water or look around. Her eyes stayed fixed on him. He unwrapped the cloth, unfolding the pages slowly. There were hand-drawn layouts, lists of costs, a sketch of a simple wooden building with a cook stove, bunk beds, shelves for medicine. Across the top, written in careful block letters, "Field house for workers. A space to rest, eat, heal." "I know this land," she said quietly. "I know its rhythm. I know how hard the harvest hits. And I know that no man, white or Apache, ought to collapse in a field just for trying to earn bread." Colt looked down at the sketches. They were good, sharp, practical, thought through. She took a breath. "You already tried it in small ways," she added, nodding toward the shelter he'd built near the south field. "That idea started somewhere. I just gave it legs. Now I want to build it out. Run it myself." "You want to stay?" he asked, his voice gravel low. "I want to work," she replied. "And yes, I want to stay." She stood with her back straight, chin high, like she was ready for him to say no, ready to be turned away. But her hands didn't tremble now. Colt saw it clear as day. She wasn't the quiet, stable girl anymore. Not the one who slipped in and out of chores like a shadow. She was a woman who'd carved herself from hardship, who'd left and lived and come back not for comfort, but for something bigger. He folded the papers slowly, wrapped them back in oilcloth, and looked at her long and hard. There was mud on her hem, dried rain on her cheeks. Her shoulders were stronger than he remembered, her gaze steadier. But beneath all that steel, he could still see it, still feel it, something neither of them had said. "I remember the night you left," he said. "I never stopped writing," she answered, "even when I stopped sending." They stood there on the porch, the rain falling all around them, the air thick with what had been unsaid for far too long. "You came back with more than a plan," he said finally. Asha nodded once. "I came back with purpose." He stepped aside, holding the door open. "Then come inside," he said, "and tell me everything." But even as she crossed the threshold, boots squeaking on the wood, the storm at her back, Colt knew the words that still hung in the air weren't written in any proposal. They were older, heavier, waiting for the right night, the right silence, the right firelight, and maybe, just maybe, for the courage to finally say them. The fire cracked low in the hearth, casting warm light across the wooden floor. Outside, the storm had softened to a whisper, just the faint patter of rain on the roof and wind easing through the cottonwoods. Inside, time moved slower, like even the house itself was holding its breath. Colt set the kettle down and poured hot water into 2 old wooden cups. One of them had a faint crack near the rim, a dark burn mark along the base. It had once belonged to his wife. He hadn't used it in years. But tonight, without thinking, he'd reach for it. He handed it to Asha. She turned it slowly in her hands, brushing her thumb over the worn groove where time had carved its signature. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. Colt nodded and sat across from her, one boot tucked under the table, the other planted square against the floor. The shadows between them danced with the flames, but neither of them looked away. "It's strange," she murmured, "sitting here again, like the wind never blew me away." He watched her a moment, then took a sip. "You were never that far." She gave a soft smile but didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the window, where the porch lantern still swayed. "There were nights," she said slowly, "in Dry Creek, when I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake listening to wagons rattle past the boarding house, folks shouting out near the saloon. But all I could think about was this place. For a year," Colt said nothing, just listened. "I'd picture the porch light, she continued. The one you left burning even when nobody was coming. I used to imagine I was still sitting on the back step, listening to the horses breathe, smelling coffee through the kitchen wall. She paused, eyes glistening in the firelight. I miss this land, the sound of your boots on the floorboards, the way you'd nod instead of saying goodbye. But more than that, I miss the way it felt, to be seen, to matter. Colt set his cup down carefully, the wood making a dull sound on the table. You did matter, he said, voice rough like gravel but steady. More than I ever said. The fire popped. Somewhere outside, a cow lowed softly into the night. I didn't know how to speak it, he continued, not when grief was still thick in my throat, not when I was afraid of what it meant. She looked at him then, really looked at him, her dark eyes clear and still, waiting, not pushing. Colt leaned back in his chair, arms folded tight across his chest like he was bracing for the truth. After my wife passed, I thought the silence was just part of the price. I figured a man could live without certain things, without laughter, without warmth, if he just stayed busy enough. His voice cracked slightly. But then you showed up, quiet, steady, just there. And I started to feel something I hadn't in a long time. Asha tilted her head, gentle but curious. What was that? He looked down at the cup, then back up at her. Like I wasn't alone. The words sat heavy in the space between them, honest, unadorned, unpolished. I don't know where this goes, he said finally, his voice lower now, quieter. I don't have a plan or a right answer. But Asha, if you hadn't knocked on that door tonight, he stopped, swallowed hard. I don't think I'd have come back to life. She didn't respond right away, just reached across the table, laid her hand over his, warm and sure. And for a long time they sat like that, two souls who'd known sorrow, who'd lived in the same silence, now finding something else in the stillness. Something like beginning again. By early spring, the northern edge of Renshaw Farm began to change. It started with a hammer, a stack of pine boards, and Asha Redbird's steady voice calling out measurements. What used to be a dry patch of mule grass and rusted fence posts slowly turned into something else. Something useful, something alive. They built the shelter together. Not a tent, not a shed, a field house just like she'd drawn. 4 solid walls, open rafters, a tin roof sloped to catch rainwater. Inside, a row of cots lined with wool blankets, a cook stove in the corner, shelves for medicine and fresh towels. Windows faced the sunrise. They called it the North House. Asha ran it with quiet authority. She kept a ledger of supplies, taught basic wound care to the younger hands, brewed strong tea for the ones who came in shaking from exhaustion. She cooked stew over the stove most evenings, letting the scent roll across the pasture. Sometimes she'd hum while she stirred, low and steady, like the hum of the earth before a rain. Colt handled the outer edges, machinery, irrigation lines, the rotation of livestock. But he never strayed too far from the North House. He checked in often, sometimes just to lean against the doorframe and say nothing, just to listen, and people started noticing. At first it was just the nearby ranchers. They'd pass by and catch sight of the tidy wooden structure and ask, "What's that old Renshaw's building up there?" When someone told them it was a care house for hired help, they scoffed. But the scoffing didn't last. Word spread about a man who no longer barked orders from a distance, about an Apache woman who treated injured men with hands firm enough to stitch but gentle enough not to shame. Folks came by just to see it, and some stayed. The ranch, once hushed and hollow, began to breathe again. Old Hank Thomas returned, this time bringing his nephew to work the season. 2 brothers from Pecos showed up looking for day labor. Even young Eli Morgan, who'd once called Asha Wild Blood, came back, hat in hand, asking if the bunkhouse still had room. It did, and no one whispered anymore. Renshaw Farm had changed. It wasn't just Colt's land now. It was theirs. A place rebuilt, not with timber and wire, but with purpose, with care, with 2 people who had known what it meant to lose and still chose to build something again. Neighbors began to speak differently. Around campfires and mercantile counters, the story shifted. They stopped calling him that widowed rancher out near the ridge. Now they said, "That's Renshaw and Redbird, the pair who turned dust into roots. She's not just his woman, she's the reason men stay through harvest. You want to see how to run a ranch with backbone and heart? Ride north. Colt noticed the change, but he didn't chase it. He still rose before the sun, still walked fence lines with the same old boots. But now when he passed by the north house, he'd tip his hat to Asha, and she'd lift her chin with that knowing look. There was something between them now, not yet named, not yet spoken, but solid like the beams of the shelter they'd built. It stood in every look they shared, in every quiet evening they spent drinking from those same wooden cups, watching the lantern light sway on the porch. And when the wind carried stories down the valley about the girl who'd come back and the man who'd waited without knowing he was waiting, they let it carry. They were too busy tending a place that finally felt like home. The season turned gentle. The worst of the spring storms had passed, leaving behind a land greening up from the inside out. Sagebrush bloomed silver blue across the hills, and the horses moved easy through the grass, tails swishing, heads low. It was the kind of quiet that didn't ask questions, just wrapped itself around you like a worn wool blanket. Asha and Colt started riding together in the mornings. No reason, really. Just the two of them, saddling up side by side. Her on the younger mare she'd trained herself. Him on the bay gelding he'd had since the war. They didn't say much out on the trail. Didn't need to. They rode fence lines, checked irrigation, sometimes just followed the ridge where the land opened up wide and empty. Then in the evenings, they'd sit on the porch. Colt kept a tin kettle by the wood stove just for coffee. He said it tasted better cooked slow over flame. Asha didn't argue. She just leaned back in the old rocking chair, his wife's chair once, now hers by quiet agreement. They'd drink and talk like people who'd known each other far longer than they had. Not lovers, not strangers, just two souls who'd stopped pretending. Sometimes they spoke of small things, how the calves were taking to pasture, or whether the corn would come in straight this year. Other times they didn't speak at all. They'd just sit there watching dusk pull its soft shadows across the valley, fireflies rising like sparks over the grass. One evening, just before the last light fell, Asha reached into her coat pocket and handed him something wrapped in cloth. "A gift," she said, plain and soft. Colt opened it carefully. Inside was a handkerchief, coarse muslin, stitched with colored thread along the edge. A single symbol, small but deliberate, was embroidered in red at the corner, a spiral inside a circle, flanked by two mountain shapes. He turned it over in his hands. The work was steady, precise. No store-bought stitching here. "This your handiwork?" he asked. "My mother's pattern," Asha said. "She taught me when I was a girl." Colt nodded. "What's it mean?" She hesitated for half a second, then looked him square in the eye. "It means," she began slowly, "the one I no longer fear to be silent beside." The words sat between them like warm bread on a cold morning. Unexpected, simple, nourishing. Colt looked down again at the cloth. His calloused thumb traced the spiral, and something in his chest shifted. Not like a break, but like a door opening after being long stuck. "You sure about that?" he asked gently. Asha smiled. "Not big, not bright, just honest." "I've never been more sure of anything." He folded the handkerchief, slid it into his breast pocket without flourish. "I'll keep it close," he said. And he did. Not just the fabric, but the meaning behind it. The weight of what she'd given, not a declaration, not a demand, but something deeper. Presence, permission, the rare gift of peace beside another. That night, as they sat in the soft hush between wind gusts, Colt reached over and rested his hand lightly on top of hers. He didn't grip it, didn't pull, just let it be there, warm and steady. Asha didn't move. She didn't need to. Their love was not the loud kind. It had no vows, no confessions shouted beneath windows. It was built in firelight and fieldwork, in shared silence and gentle gestures. It asked for nothing but presence, and in that it found everything. Evenings settled slow over the Renshaw place, the kind of hush that comes only after a long day's work, when the dust finally stops rising and the wind turns soft enough to carry birdsong. The sky burned with the last of the sun, casting a red-orange glow across the far hills, where fence posts stood like sentinels along the ridge. Colt sat on the porch, boots propped on the rail, a mug of warm coffee cupped in his hands. The boards creaked beside him as Asha sat down, her shawl draped loose over her shoulders, the edges catching the last of the light. They didn't speak for a while, just watched the fields shift with color, gold to rust to ash, as the sun slipped behind the cottonwoods. Then in a voice low and steady, Asha asked, "Is this love?" Colt didn't answer right away. He stared out across the land. His land, her land now too. Dry, demanding, but alive in a way it hadn't been in years. "I don't know," he said finally, his tone quiet but certain, "but I know that since the day you came back, I haven't felt lost inside myself." Asha didn't smile, but her fingers reached out and curled gently around the sleeve of his shirt. Just enough to say, "I'm here." They hadn't spoken of marriage, no rings, no preacher summoned from Dry Creek, and that was fine. There were no promises carved in stone between them, only acts. Every morning, Asha lit the stove and boiled water, her hair still damp from creek water. She kneaded bread while the sun yawned over the valley. Sometimes she sang, low and wordless. Colt would head out early, leather gloves tugged on tight, tools clanging in a canvas sack. He patched gates, rehung wire, taught the younger ranch hands how to mend without waste. At noon, he'd return smelling of sweat and horses, and she'd meet him on the porch with a plate of beans and cornbread. No words needed. There was something sacred in the routine, not the kind found in chapel pews or county courthouses, but in the unspoken, in staying, in the mending of things, fences, hearts, silences. Neighbors still talked, of course, but now they spoke with a softness, a sort of earned reverence. They didn't fix the land, but they made it livable. They didn't marry by law, but you watch them. There's a bond stronger than paper. That place used to be dead quiet. Now it breathes. Colt sometimes thought back to the man he was before Asha returned, the one who moved like a shadow across his own home, chasing ghosts, mistaking stillness for survival. He wasn't that man anymore. And as for Asha, she had stopped looking over her shoulder. The past was still there, tucked into old letters and faint scars. But she walked forward now, head high, hands steady, belonging without needing permission. As the last light dipped below the horizon, Colt turned toward her. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll need to ride out to the east fence. Storm bent the corner post pretty good." Asha nodded. "I'll pack us lunch." No poetry, no declarations, just another day ahead, shared. That was enough, because in a world that was still dry, still harsh, still unforgiving, they had chosen to stay, chosen to rise each morning, side by side, chosen to fix what could be fixed and live with what couldn't. And in that quiet choice, repeated with every sunrise, they had built something truer than any vow. They had built home,